I am just so excited to be with you this morning in this church of joy. Yeah. And I want to thank you for sharing Pastor Nino with us at Evangel. I will tell you, our board meetings are better because he is there. Yeah. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you what a man of wisdom and prayer and insight that you have. And so thank you for sharing him with us. So I was thinking about, I've lived my whole life in education. That is the place God has called me to serve. It started actually for me even as an undergraduate school a very long time ago at what was then Evangel College. And I actually well, you never conclude your educational training, but it actually brought me to Florida, where eventually I came to do my doctorate at Florida State. So if you have any Seminole fans in the room, or if you're a Gator, I think I'm a little closer to Gator country than I am Seminole country. But what I realize is I live my life in a world of questions. In fact, last spring, I was meeting with Dr. Burnett, who was retiring after 51 years of service as provost, but his academic training is a mathematician. So if there's anyone who knows about numbers, it's Dr. Burnett. And so we were sitting in my office, and we were thinking about students getting ready to graduate, and I said, so, Dr. Burnett, how many questions do you think students have answered by the time they graduate as part of their academic program? Being the mathematician that he was, we talked about the number of classes they would take, somewhere between 120, 130 credit hours, about how many exams they'd take in each class. Anyway, he came up with a calculation that somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 questions students would answer during the course of their undergraduate education program. And so as the students were preparing to graduate, I congratulated them that they had answered the last question that they would need to answer in order to take a diploma from Evangel University. And then I said, I've got good news and bad news. You've answered enough to graduate. Hopefully it's not such bad news. You're going to be answering questions the rest of your life. If you have young children, you know about this, right? The number one question probably that you hear, how many times a day? Why? Why? And little children are full of questions. Actually, I am intrigued by the questions that God asks. I lived a portion of my life in the world of assessment where we were in the business of asking questions that students would answer, and they would actually pay to take those tests and answer those questions. And at some period there, I became intrigued by the questions that show up in God's Word. The fact that God would ask questions. It's not like he doesn't know the answer or he needs to know the answer, but the value of that is the questions he poses to us. So I spent a year as I was reading through the Bible, just writing down every question that God asked. And you get to the New Testament, and you realize even in the New Testament, Christ asks over 100 questions. These are not trick questions. They often appear as simple, straightforward questions that have a clarity. They are easily understood by the listener. However, if we pause to think about them, they are profoundly deep, profoundly insightful, and probing. And answering them goes to the deepest places of our pain, our brokenness, our hopes, our dreams, and our longings. Questions like, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his life? Why are you so afraid? Why do you doubt? Who do you say that I am? What is it you want? What is your name? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say? So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? Do you understand what I have done for you? These are just a few of the questions that I think are worth thinking about. In the Old Testament, there is a dialogue that we are very familiar with. It occurs between the 3rd and 4th chapters of Exodus. It's this conversation. Actually, it ends up being a debate, an argument that God has with Moses. God asks Moses a question, and then Moses has an argument with God. You see, Moses had had a rather extraordinary youth, rescued from a floating crib, adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, raised with all the wealth and privileges of royalty, became a militant activist, killed an Egyptian, fled and lived as an alien for 40 years, traded his royal robes for the rough robes and a simple staff of a shepherd. And while minding his own business, God calls him by name with an assignment to return to Egypt and lead the people to freedom. Moses' response to God's call was actually a series of questions. 3. Who am I to do this? Who will I say you are? And what if they don't believe me or listen to me? What's interesting is God answers each of his questions. His first question, who am I? God's answer, you tell them I'll be with you. In other words, Moses, it doesn't matter who you are. It matters who I am. And that I am with you. In essence, it's not about you, Moses. What matters is who I am. To his second question, who will I say you are? You tell them I am who I am, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And then he gives them a full message for the elders of Israel. And in response to Moses' third question, interestingly, God doesn't answer this question, and instead, he asks Moses a question. And this is where we pick up in Exodus 4. Moses answered, what if they don't believe me or listen to me when I say the Lord, and they say the Lord did not appear to you? Then the Lord said to him, and this is the question I want us to ponder this morning. What's in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. They go on to argue for a while. And finally, Moses says, yes. So the question is, what's in your hand? And what will you do with it? God's question to Moses, what's in your hand, Moses? Throw it on the ground. We know the rest of the story, right? What had been a simple shepherd's staff, a simple wooden stick, now becomes the rod of God. What did that staff represent? It represented Moses' identity. He was a shepherd, and so he carried a shepherd's staff, not a rescuer or a national leader. It represented his livelihood, the way he supported his family. It represented his position in the community, that of a shepherd. It represented his security. And God says, in essence, give it to me. And it will be used for my glory, for my kingdom, and for far more than you could ever imagine or think. He challenges Moses to realize that his identity is in the God of his father. His ability to provide for not just his family, but for his nation is in God's hands, not his. His position among his people is determined by God's call and his obedience to that call. And his security is in God, not in a job, not in a title, not in a position, not in his family relationships, or in a wooden stick that symbolized those things. So the challenge for us is, what do we do with what's in our hand? You see, we all have a choice. We can choose to cling to what we think is ours. Mine. This is mine. Or we can let it go. So what are those things that we hold so tightly to? Sometimes they're good things. I think one of the biggest challenges as our students complete their degree is that moment when I say, okay, now I'm going to hand you a degree. I want you to give it away. It's not yours. What you do with that education that God has allowed you to receive is in his hands, not yours. And I think the same is true of all of those things that we hold so dear. Whether it's a family member, our children, the place God has called us to serve, the opportunities that he has opened for us for employment or position or influence, they're not ours. There are other things we hold to, things that prevent us from experiencing and receiving all that God has for us. Things like disappointment and loss and pain and brokenness and addiction. And in the same way, God says, throw it down. Don't cling to it. Because if you let it go, I will give something back to you that will be more than a wooden stick. You see, Scripture is full of stories of those who released what was in their hands, only to discover that God had a plan and a vision and a dream that was far beyond what they could imagine. People like Hannah, this woman who had been barren for year after year after year, and she weeps before the Lord, crying for a child. And God hears her prayers and gives her a son. And what does she do? She releases that child she had prayed so long for. And as a result, we have the great prophet Samuel. Abraham releases his son of long-awaited promise, literally lays his Isaac down, and a nation is born. Joseph released his bitterness and his right to revenge and saved not only his family, but the entire nation of Israel. Ruth gave up her people and her culture and her religion for Naomi's people and culture and Naomi's God. And a child was born whose lineage leads to the Messiah. Esther releases her own life and saves her nation. Job says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And we have the book of Job to comfort all who suffer. Mary released her reputation, and Joseph released his rights as a husband. And we have the Messiah and salvation. Paul releases his self-righteousness, his credentials, his privileges, and surrenders to the very one he persecuted. And we have much of the New Testament. And so I come back to this question, this one question. The question that God asks Moses. It's a question he asks us as well. So what's in your hand? What are you clinging to? What will you do with what you've been given? If you give it to me, in essence, throw it down. I will take whatever it is, and I will multiply it and use it for my glory. I saw this in a real way in my own family's lives. I had a brother who lived in darkness for a long, long time, and I watched my parents pray for him for decades and release him again and again. God, he's yours. We release him to you. And in the last months of his life, saw the great joy of him coming back to a faith that he had grown up with and have a glorious homegoing. My father was he referred to himself as just a simple businessman. God had wired him to know how things worked. So he was an engineer in the automotive business. But God also gave him the heart of an evangelist. And so whether it was in the workplace or if it was in his community, he loved nothing more but to share his love of God with the community. And I grew up in Chicago, and when I moved to California in 2000, it was 2 years later that my parents joined me there. Now both with some health issues, and it was a wonderful season of life in Southern California. At that time, my father was retired. He'd been very, very active in the church and had reached a point where he said, I don't think I should keep teaching Sunday school. I tend to wander too much when I talk, and probably God has something else for me to do. And he was directing men's retreat. And so one year, this was still when they were in the Chicago area, he made crosses for all the men at the retreat. And I could never quite figure out whether it was the joy of actually making the cross or inventing new tooling that would create more intricate designs, because he made all of his own tooling. And so by the time they arrive in California, he's now making very intricate inlaid crosses that have copper halos embedded in them and beautiful inlaid stands. These are beautiful works of art. And he gives them away. He would be asked from time to time, well, how much do you want for your cross? He said, no. This is what I do for the pure joy of sharing the cross. And it became his way of sharing his faith. So in Southern California, not unlike Florida, you can work outdoors almost 12 months of the year. And so my father continued making these crosses in the garage. And one day my mother said, so Cliff, I think, how many of those things have you made and given away? Dad says, I don't know. She said, I think you should start numbering them, and you should put a date on it and sign your name. So when you give it away, someone remembers who gave it to them. And so my father began numbering them and dating them and signing his name on them. And as he worked and met people, we lived in this cul-de-sac. It was a very diverse community. We had people who spoke Spanish and Korean and Japanese and Thai and Tagalog. It was this wonderful, diverse community. And it wasn't within a year, every person in our neighborhood had one of my father's crosses. He used to say, if God thumps my heart, when I meet someone, if God just kind of thumps my heart, I will offer them a cross. And if there is an opportunity, I will share with them what the cross means to me. But he had this burden for our neighbors. So 10 years later, And my father now has a major heart issue, and we realize it will likely be the last year of his life. And he agonized over, but only one of our neighbors has come to faith. It was Pete, our Japanese neighbor, and his family, and they were attending church. And my dad kept these prayer lists. He wrote all the names of all of our neighbors were on his prayer list, and he prayed for them every day as he would work in the garage with the door open and greet them. And he was interesting because he was the oldest guy in the neighborhood, and many of them had great respect because he was a World War II veteran, but mostly because he loved them. And I remember in the last months of his life, he would say, I said, Dad, so what are you hanging on to? Well, it feels the work is not finished. Only Pete has come to faith. And we would have these conversations, but Dad, you have given everything. You have given yourself to our neighbors. You have loved them. You've given them your crosses. I think we can trust God to finish what he has started. It was amazing. And then Dad let go of many things and became very, very eager for heaven. And it was on his last night that one of our young neighbors, Joe, Korean family, who's a detective, came and sat and talked with Dad. My dad could no longer talk to him. But he sat by his bedside and said, Mr. Taylor, I want you to know today 15 of your neighbors went to church to honor you. And at my father's funeral, I went to the garage to look at the last set of crosses he had been working on. And in his memorial service, people brought the crosses. And so we had a wonderful time reflecting on the joy of the cross and what the cross means. It is our hope and our salvation. And I look, and there's a whole section of our neighborhood that had come. And a year later, what happened that night that Joe came and sat with Dad, it was Palm Sunday. He said, Mr. Taylor, I want you to know I finally you have been asking us for 10 years to come to church. And this morning, my wife and my children and I went to church to honor you. And I want you to know my wife wept the whole time. We learned out later, Joe also wept that morning in church. He said, I want you to know that I am going to keep going for myself and for my family. That next summer, and Joe kept his promise, that next summer, our church, my parents' church, sponsored an orphanage in Mexico, just south of San Diego, and often groups would go down to volunteer and work there. And Joe tells me, I'm taking my family to Mexico for a week of vacation. I want my children to learn how to give and care for others. And last fall, our first fall in Springfield, after returning to Evangel, I got a text message from Joe. Carol, I want you to know that Pastor has invited Donna and me to the stage Sunday morning to talk about your father. You see, there's a section in the church now that is full of people that have committed their lives to Christ because of the influence of your father. So today we are 25 strong, baptized, committed. There's another 25 that are in process. But I want you to know what your father's life has meant to us. So we got the video of the service. I played it for my mother. We played it again. And of course, we wept. I imagine my father looking down from heaven, full of joy, one day saying to Christ, look who I brought with me. Some would say he didn't have much. He was an engineer. God gave him skills to see how things work. And eventually he applied that to making beautiful, intricate crosses that he gave away. But they were offered in the same way that Moses offered that staff. And what became bits of wood, carved and inlaid and polished and then signed, became a tool to multiply as a testimony to Christ. And I realized as I was preparing for my father's memorial service and I picked up the crosses that in those 10 years that we shared a home in Southern California, he had made and given away over 1,500 crosses. And we continue to get reports of how they have inspired and how they have encouraged so many people. And so God says, what's in your hand? What are you holding on to? Will you give it to me? Will you give it to me? Will you see what I can do with it when you throw it down? In my hands, it will be used for my glory. It will be used for my purpose that perhaps today you can't imagine. And so he asks us, what's in your hand? What have I given you that you're holding to? What do you have that you can't grasp what I have for you because you won't let something go? We can trust him. We can trust him that the plans that he has are good and for his glory and for his honor. I often think today I hold in my hands something I never imagined I would hold, and that's a university. And every day I'm reminded, I don't want to throw it down, but but to hold it this way. This precious school that God has entrusted me with, where we will equip and train young men and women to understand not just who they are, but whose they are. And that God has a plan for their lives. And if they will lead their lives this way, God, all that I have, all that I am, all that you give me is yours. God will use it to change the world. And so I ask you, what's in your hand? What will you do with it? I encourage you, throw it down. Throw it down. Let him give it back to you, full of his power and his blessing and his purposes. And you will be used for his glory.